Thanks for coming out today. We sort of somehow managed to avoid a snow day, thank God. Professor Cloward flew in from Dallas last night, so if we would have had a snow day, it would have upset me. All right, so speaking of Professor Karisa Cloward, she received her PhD from Yale University in 2010 and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research and teaching interests place her at the intersection of international relations and comparative politics, with particular attention to non-governmental organizations, international norms and transnational activism, international aid, sub-Saharan African politics, and gender in politics. Professor Cloward is currently working on a book project, which we mentioned,
actual book
that evaluates the range of ways communities react to international activism by focus on the harmful traditional practices of female genital mutilation and early marriage among the Maasai and Samburu communities in rural Kenya. If you want to check out the book, I'm going to get at least one copy for the library. The book's titled "When Norms Collide: Local Responses to Activism Against Female Genital Mutilation in Early Marriage" in Oxford University Press. Let's welcome Professor.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak here today. Can you hear me or? So what I'd like to talk about today is at least part of my brand new book, which is looking at how individuals and communities respond to transnational activism that promotes the international norms against female genital mutilation, which for concision purposes I'm going to refer to as FGM throughout the rest of the talk, and against early marriage. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of the book as a whole before focusing in on one element of that book, which is about how people change their rhetoric about the practices of FGM and early marriage in the face of activists. So I'll give you a little bit of the question, the argument, some overview of the issues of FGM and early marriage, because people aren't always terribly familiar with these two practices, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my findings. So first of all, we need to know what a norm is. So I'm defining it as a shared standard of behavior appropriate for actors with a given identity. Right? The key thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about a norm is that it is social. Right? So norms are maintained by other people. And there's a quality of oughtness to them. So we conform to norms because other people expect us to. And when we fail to conform to norms, we open ourselves up to the judgment of our community and potentially to some form of punishment for violating those norms. So why am I asking about these issues? Well, it turns out that actually there are a lot of transnational campaigns that are focused on promoting international norms around particular issues, right? And international norms that specifically target the behavior of individuals. Right? Those individuals in turn have competing local norms most of the time. So new international norms don't enter a vacuum on the ground. Right? They actually come face to face with pre-existing local norms. Right? And so then the question becomes, what happens when the international and local norms collide? Right? Under what conditions should we expect that individuals and communities will abandon their existing local norms in favor of embracing these new international norms? So I'm looking specifically at the issues of FGM and early marriage, but there are lots of other kinds of issues for which such norm conflicts are a real issue. Right? So a lot of other areas related to women's rights and gender violence, as well as public health issues and environmental issues, involve getting actual individual human beings to try to change their behavior. And so the question then becomes, how does that work? Right? And additionally, I care about this question for a sort of practical reason as well. Right? The practices of FGM and early marriage affect millions of women and girls around the world, and so we really want to start to get a better sense of the conditions under which these two practices decline. So the book as a whole is focused on trying to explain individual and community level norm change, specifically with respect to FGM and to early marriage. And as part of doing that, I break down the idea of norm change into a few different component parts or elements. Right? So I'm distinguishing between people changing their attitudes about their local norms and about the international norms, people changing their actual behavior, right, in response to these international norms, and also people changing their rhetoric, right, the way they talk about their behavior and their attitudes. Right? So essentially I'm saying, once people are exposed to an international norm, what are the conditions under which they're going to change their attitudes, their behavior, and their rhetoric? Once people know about an international norm, when will they change what they think, what they do, and what they say? So to try to get at this question, I'm looking at three Ma-speaking Kenyan communities. Kenya is a nice case for this because it's a country where rates of FGM and early marriage are variable throughout the country and are also on the decline in some places, right? So that gives me a lot of variation to work with in terms of thinking about what's causing changes in these practices. Ma-speaking communities, that's a sort of diverse group, but I'm focused in particular on the Maasai and the Samburu, and both of these groups have long histories of both FGM and early marriage. And yet different Maasai and Samburu communities are changing their behavior and their attitudes and their rhetoric to differing degrees. Right? So the way I'm trying to look at these three communities is through a few different approaches. I spent about 14 months in Kenya doing field work, and during that time I conducted around 150 in-depth interviews with various community stakeholders in my three communities. And I also conducted an original survey among 600 members of the general population. And then within that survey, I conducted an experiment. Right? And the experiment was designed to try to gauge whether people would misrepresent their true level of commitment to the international norms against FGM and early marriage if they thought they were talking to an international audience. And so it's on that last part that I'm going to focus the rest of the talk. Do people change their rhetoric, right? And in some cases hide their true normative commitments when they encounter international audiences broadly and international activists specifically? So the key question here is, under what conditions individuals are going to misrepresent their normative commitments? The book as a whole does actually show that people are in the process of changing their attitudes and their behavior as well in some cases, right? So there are genuine changes in people's local norms that are occurring in all of these communities, although to varying degrees, right? But to the extent that we depend on people's self-reported attitude and behavior change to conclude that people really are changing, there's maybe some cause for concern. Right? There may well be good incentives for people when they encounter an international audience to want to try to project an image of compliance with an international norm that audience is promoting. Right? So what I argue is that norm conflicts make misrepresentation more likely. Right? The more that people perceive a particular international norm as being directly in conflict with their own local norms, the more likely it is that they will be inclined to hide their true feelings, right, and their true actions. So they're going to be disinclined to actually change their attitudes and their behavior rapidly, right? But they still may want to convince an international audience that they are changing their attitudes and behavior. Sorry. All of this projecting from the diaphragm is thirsty work. So the simplest strategy here is to just rhetorically commit to the international norms, right? So there are lots of ways to hide your continuing compliance with the local norm. But the easiest thing is just to say, I've stopped doing that. Okay? So we can think about the conditions under which people might deploy that strategy. Oops, got ahead of myself there. So one reason that they could do this is to try to win some kind of reputational reward. So here I'm drawing on literature in social psychology on image management and deception. And this literature says to us that actually we're all sort of managing the image we present to the world kind of at all times. Right? We encounter different audiences, and we do things to try to make those audiences like us. That's sort of human nature. And sometimes the image that we present to a sort of an audience is largely truthful, and sometimes it involves some degree of deception. And the research on deception suggests that people are most likely to engage in deception when they expect some sort of reputational benefit from doing so. So they want to be perceived as good or agreeable or smart or some other kind of positive attribute, and they want to protect themselves from being seen as bad or inconsistent or behind the times or any number of other negative attributes. Right? And so all of that is incentivizing people to present an image that is in line with what they think the audience wants to hear. So they're particularly likely to do this if the audience that they encounter is high status in some way, and if the audience has some sort of power over them. And if we think about the kinds of conditions present between international activists and local communities, that's certainly true. Right? International actors and activists come into some of these communities, and they have a lot more wealth, and in some cases they're viewed as having quite a bit of prestige. And not only that, but they also in some cases have some degree of control over the distribution of aid to rural communities. Right? And thus there's also something about financial incentive for people to misrepresent themselves. We can think about the international development sector as existing in sort of an aid chain. So you've got big international donors, the US Agency for International Development, for example, or the World Bank, and they make grants to big international NGOs like World Vision or Oxfam. And then World Vision and Oxfam make grants to national NGOs based in developing countries. Right? And then those national NGOs make grants to grassroots community-based organizations. And at the end of that chain is the communities. And so even though they're not always closely connected to the donors, people in these communities, through exposure to all of these various activist groups, do over time come to learn what it is the international community wants to hear. And they may well consider that agreeing with the international community is a good way to keep the money flowing. And so both of these can incentivize some form of misrepresentation. So I want to stop for a second and tell you a little bit more about the practices of FGM in early marriage. So the World Health Organization defines FGM as all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. Early marriage is a simpler definition. Here we're just talking about marriage of children or adolescents under the age of 18. If we want to look at the distribution of these practices around the world, FGM is largely concentrated in Africa, although not entirely. So we're looking at 29 African and Middle Eastern countries where FGM occurs, as well as in Indonesia and among other isolated groups in Southeast Asia, and then also among immigrant communities throughout the rest of the world. The UN Children's Fund estimates that around 200 million women alive today have undergone FGM in their lives. So this isn't necessarily a small-scale problem or one that's isolated to just a handful of people. Right? As many as 3 million African girls are at risk annually of being cut. When it comes to early marriage, well, this is spread out a bit more around the world. One estimate suggested that in just the first decade of the 21st century, not the 20th century, the 21st century, 58 million women and girls were married before the age of 18, and that some 15 million of those were married before the age of 15. Altogether, about 1/3 of women aged 20 to 24 in the developing world have been married before they hit age 18. Okay? So both of these problems have a significant real scope in the world. So we've talked about the idea that there are international and local norms related to these practices, so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the contents of those norms. The logic of the international norms against both FGM and early marriage relates significantly to ideas about health, about gender equality, and about human rights. So when you hear people making arguments in opposition to these practices, these are the sort of the bases of their claims for why people should give up these practices, right? That it will be healthier for girls, that it will improve gender equality, and that it will protect girls' rights. These international norms have been codified in a variety of different international treaties and other consensus documents. So, for example, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action takes a strong stand against both FGM and early marriage. And the norms have been invoked by a really wide array of different activist groups. Particularly in the case of FGM, there's been something of a global campaign that really started to take off in the 1970s and has escalated since then. There hasn't been as much concerted activism around early marriage, but it is something that a lot of groups talk about in the context of promoting broader women's rights. But if we have international norms, we also need to have the conflicting local norms. Here it's really important to keep in mind that the reasons that people practice FGM and early marriage vary a lot from country to country, from group to group, from community to community, in some cases from family to family. And so there isn't always going to be one consistent justification for why people practice FGM or why people practice early marriage. In the case of FGM, various justifications are used. In some cases, it's viewed as a way of preserving premarital virginity. In some cases, it's viewed as a way of preserving marital fidelity. In some cases, it's viewed as a rite of passage to adulthood. In some cases, it's viewed as a religious requirement. In some cases, it's viewed as simply promoting a variety of sort of positive attributes of women: femininity, cleanliness, sort of virtue, various things that are otherwise associated with good women in some of these societies. With early marriage, a lot of explanations for this hinge on some form of economic need. So you've got communities where people are living with sort of subsistence incomes or with relatively little disposable income in times of hardship. It may be viewed as a good option to marry off a daughter to reduce the economic burden on the family. And the economic incentives can even be greater than that. In a lot of countries, you have the payment of bride price or bride wealth. Right? So when a girl is married, the groom's family pays the family of the bride in exchange for taking her away. So that financial remuneration can be a really important incentive to marry off a girl in a time of hardship. But there are also other justifications more related to cultural values associated, again, with sort of what it means to be a good wife or a good woman in general. So if you marry a girl earlier in her life, she's more likely to be a virgin at marriage. She's more likely to be submissive to her husband. She's more likely to have more children over the course of her life. And all of these things are valued and thus incentivize early marriage. So if we think about Kenya, with FGM, we're looking at about 21% of women in Kenya who've been cut. But among the Maasai, it's a much higher proportion, right? 78% of Maasai in the most recent survey, Maasai women reported having undergone FGM. With early marriage, the estimate is at about 31% countrywide and about 46% among the Maasai. So the Kenyan government has acceded to some of these international norms opposing FGM and early marriage. It's signed all of the sort of requisite treaties that talk about prohibition of FGM and early marriage, and it's also taken some domestic action by outlawing both practices and introducing a variety of other kinds of policies designed to promote abandonment of FGM and early marriage. But realistically, the laws prohibiting FGM and early marriage in Kenya are rarely enforced. And so we shouldn't necessarily expect them to have a big impact on people's real behavior. Within Kenya, the Maasai and the Samburu traditionally circumcise a girl during puberty. For the Maasai and Samburu, FGM is viewed as a rite of passage to adulthood, and so that timing at puberty makes a lot of sense. A girl would then be married shortly thereafter. So within a few days to a few months after her circumcision, she would get married and she would go to live with the family of her husband. And all of the decision making around both of these practices for the Maasai and Samburu rests with the parents and especially with the father. So girls themselves have very little control over whether they are circumcised or when or to whom they are married. I looked at 3 communities specifically, and these are communities that have experienced varying levels of change with respect to both of these practices. So Old Nyiro, right up here at the top, is the community that's sort of made the least movement in terms of norm change. It's a very isolated community. You can't reach it by car during the rainy season. There's quite low educational provision in the community. There's no real town of anything to speak of there. Activism has been incredibly low regarding FGM and early marriage. And so it's not at all surprising that people's attitudes about these practices haven't really changed, and certainly their behavior hasn't really changed. As a result of that, there's perhaps not a ton of incentive for people in Old Nyiro to misrepresent themselves to international actors because they haven't been exposed to international actors and they don't necessarily know what it is that international actors want to hear. Mukogoro is sort of the middle case, so this is a community that's somewhat more accessible, has somewhat better educational provision, has experienced somewhat more activism against FGM and early marriage. So awareness levels about the international norms against FGM and early marriage are relatively high, but attitude change and behavior change have been slower in coming. And so in a community like that, you should expect a real reason for people to misrepresent themselves. Right? These folks definitely know what the international community wants to hear, but they don't have the sort of the behavior that would satisfy the international community. So the incentive to misrepresent is going to be strong. Mao is the final community here. And Mao is the community that is sort of most accessible, best educated, has the most sort of cosmopolitan feel. It has a couple of town centers. There's been a sort of a sustained campaign against FGM and early marriage in this community for a couple of decades now, and it's starting to have an effect. So awareness levels are very, very high about the international norms opposing these two practices. Attitude change has also occurred to a pretty significant degree. behavior change is additionally underway, but it's not complete. And so there are still going to be incentives here for people to misrepresent themselves if they're not complying with the international norm, but they encounter an international audience. So how do I go about trying to figure out whether people will, in fact, misrepresent themselves? Part of this involves a survey experiment. So I want to see whether I could get people to falsely commit to the international norms against FGM and early marriage. And so what I did was conduct a survey. And in the context of the survey, all of the respondents were asked the same set of questions. Right? They were asked about their knowledge, their experiences, their attitudes, and their practices with respect to FGM and to early marriage. But half of the respondents were randomly selected and told that there was an international audience for the survey. Right? So that constitutes my treatment group. And the other half of the respondents were told that the audience for the survey was ultimately a local one. Right? So there's a statement at the beginning of the survey and then another statement about halfway through telling people sort of who is paying attention to the results of this survey. Right? So this is the first treatment statement. So the people in the treatment group got this statement or heard this statement at the very beginning of the survey. Right? And you can see that it emphasizes that American researchers are really interested in the results of the survey, that policymakers in the US and in England, Britain was Kenya's colonial power, that the UN is interested, the New York Times is interested, that all of these sort of international groups really care what the respondents to the survey have to say about FGM and early marriage. And the people in the control group got very similar statements, but the people involved were changed. So they became local audiences instead of international audiences. So why do this as an experiment? Why not just ask people whether talking to an international audience changes the way that people talk about FGM and early marriage? Well, the big reason here, and there are a lot of advantages to doing a randomized experiment, but one of the big advantages of a randomized experiment is that it helps you deal with the issue of selection bias. The idea here is that when we're talking about human beings, right, they don't just randomly find themselves in different kinds of situations. People choose to put themselves in particular kinds of situations. Right? And so we would expect that the kinds of people who regularly encounter an international audience are going to be different from the kinds of people who do not regularly encounter an international audience. Right? They're probably going to be better traveled, they may be better educated, there's maybe just sort of more cosmopolitan in general. And so if we were to observe that people in the real world who encountered an international audience were more likely to oppose things like FGM and early marriage, it would be really difficult for us to know whether their opposition was actually a result of their exposure to the international audience, or instead just the fact that they're different sorts of people. Right? So the really nice thing about an experiment is that you can do away with that problem, right? By sort of randomly picking from a single pool of individuals who is going to be exposed to an international audience and who is going to be exposed to a local audience, you can then control sort of every other confounding factor that might interfere. So at the end of that, if you observe that people in the treatment group say different things than people in the control group, you can actually conclude that it was the treatment itself that caused them to do it. Right? The exposure to the international audience is going to be the thing that explains why they're giving a different response, not some other confounding factor, because there are no other confounding factors in a case like this. So that's the clear advantage here. So what did the results show us? Well, when we looked at people's reported past behavior and their intended future behavior, the results were pretty startling. So when respondents were asked whether they planned to circumcise a daughter in the future, respondents in the treatment group, so the respondents who were told they were talking to an international audience, were 11 percentage points less likely to say that they would subject a daughter to circumcision in the future than respondents in the control group. When we asked them about whether their most recently married daughter was married before the age of 18, they were 21 percentage points less likely to admit that she'd been married before age 18 than respondents in the control group. Right? So that's a really big substantive effect. When people thought they were talking to an international audience instead of a local audience, they were much less likely to sort of admit local norm compliant behavior, to admit that they were continuing to practice FGM and early marriage. We can also see the effects here when we think about each of the individual communities in isolation. So there was a treatment effect in all of the communities, but the size of the effect really varied. So in Old and Euro, the treatment effect was much smaller, right? And that conforms to our expectations. The folks in Old and Euro have been less exposed to international messaging about FGM and early marriage, and so they ought to have less incentive to misrepresent themselves than people in Mukogoto or Mao. Right? So that holds up when we're looking at intention to circumcise a daughter in the future, and it also holds up when we're looking at the respondents' willingness to admit that their most recently married daughter had been married underage. Right? So there is a treatment effect in each case, but how big of an effect varies a lot from community to community. Mukogoto in particular has a much bigger effect, and that, again, that really makes sense. Right? This is a community that has very high levels of awareness about FGM and early marriage and the international opposition to these practices, but that hasn't actually experienced that much true behavior change. Right? So there's a big gap between what people know the international community wants them to be doing and what people are actually doing. And that creates a big space for people to misrepresent themselves. Right? So that's when the question's related to behavior. However, when we got around to talking about attitudes, the story was really different. Right? So it turned out that no matter what kinds of questions we asked about attitudes, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, it didn't make any difference whatsoever. So respondents in the treatment group were more likely to say that FGM should be stopped than respondents in the control group. Similarly, they were no more likely than respondents in the control group to say that early marriage should be stopped. So people are misrepresenting their behavior with respect to FGM and early marriage, but not their attitudes. Right? That's a bit of a puzzle. Why would they be doing that? And here I think the explanation comes down to the social aspect of norms that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. Right? That people don't always change their behavior in line with their attitudes. Right? The pull of the local norm is strong. People in their community expect them to circumcise their daughters and marry them fairly young. Right? So even if they've changed their attitudes, they may not have changed their behavior. Right? And so there's going to be a gap not just between awareness and behavior, but between attitudes and behavior. Right? People are not going to be as quick to abandon a practice like FGM just because they no longer agree with it if everyone in their community still expects them to be doing it. Right? And so we can think about maybe 3 groups of respondents here. Right? The first group of respondents is the group that actually has become fully compliant with the international norm. Right? Which is to say, they've changed both their attitudes and their behavior about FGM and early marriage. These people don't need to misrepresent themselves to an international audience because they're already doing exactly what the international audience wants them to be doing. Right? Second group would be people who've maintained complete compliance with the local norm. They've changed neither their attitudes nor their behavior about FGM and early marriage. Right? these people are probably least likely to care what folks in the international community think of them. Right? So they also maybe don't have a great incentive to misrepresent themselves. But there's a third group. And the third group are the people with inconsistent attitudes and behavior. The people who've changed their attitudes, but their behavior doesn't yet match their own new beliefs. Right? And so what I think is going on here is that people in this group are representing their attitudes honestly, right? And then they're pretending that their behavior matches those attitudes, when in fact it does not. Right? So in some sense, their misrepresentation here is aspirational. Right? They wish they could be fully complying with these international norms, and so they present themselves in that way. But their behavior just isn't there to match it. I also did a lot of interviews, and that helps to clarify some of the logic here. So I spoke with a whole bunch of different kinds of folks in the three communities. I spoke to NGO workers, I spoke to workers at community-based organizations, I spoke to religious leaders, government officials, traditional circumcisers, traditional birth attendants, local elders, all sorts of folks who might have some kind of stake in the process of FGM and early marriage or the campaign against FGM and early marriage. And these interviews revealed a number of important findings. The first is that misrepresentation happens a lot. Right? So many of my interviewees reported that indeed people were misrepresenting themselves to international audiences, and they were doing it to impress or please or otherwise pacify these international audiences. And that misrepresentation was made easier by the fact that foreign aid workers or foreign activists often only kind of dropped in for short trips, and so they weren't able to observe whether people were telling the truth over the long term. Secondly, there was evidence of a reputational motive for people to misrepresent themselves. Right? So people over and over again talked about the prestige associated with international actors and the ways and the sort of the high status that international actors had, and a desire to persuade those international actors that they agreed with them. But there were also financial incentives here. Right? That people did emphasize that there were real sort of material concerns for people. A lot of Messiah and Samburu are quite poor. They are heavily dependent on foreign aid in some form or another, and many of them seem to have concluded that it was in their interest to agree with international actors in order to keep the aid flowing. That was true for sort of the average community member, but especially true for people working for local NGOs and community-based organizations. So these folks were essentially being paid to engage in activism against FGM and early marriage, and for a lot of them, it seemed that they were doing so very strategically. So they themselves had not changed their behavior, even though they were actively promoting the international norms. Right? And lastly, I did observe in the qualitative interviews, just as in the experimental results, that people in Old and Euro were less likely to report that the interviewees in Old and Euro were less likely to report that people were misrepresenting themselves. Right? They just had less exposure to these international actors, and so my interviewees talked about this misrepresentation problem a lot less than my interviewees in the other two communities. All right, so what we can say about this, well, there's clearly evidence that individuals do falsely commit to international norms for both reputational and material gain. Right? That's important. So for starters, it tells us that we really should pay attention to the distinction between different elements of norm change, right? That understanding people's attitudes about these practices doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about their behavior or their rhetoric, and vice versa, right? So we really do have to keep in mind that these things do not necessarily move together. Right? And it also provides some practical implications, both for activists and maybe for the general population. Right? That for activists, they should be cautious in interpreting people's self-reported attitude and behavior change as signaling that there truly has been meaningful change on the ground, that there are going to be significant incentives for people to misrepresent themselves. And for everyone else, right, who spends time in another culture, who ends up working abroad, it's important to be cognizant of the potential for some kind of norm conflict, right? That foreigners who show up do not introduce new norms into a vacuum, that people have their own strong existing commitments to particular issues, and they're not going to just sort of throw those over easily. And when they don't, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for people to misrepresent themselves, especially where there are significant power dynamics involved, right? Especially where you as the foreigner have some power or authority over the person with whom you are working or to whom you are speaking. There are going to be incentives for people to tell you what they think you want to hear, right? And so it's always going to be really important to keep that in mind, right? The sort of the incentives that different cultures and competing norms are going to create in relationships between folks from these different cultures. So I will stop there and open it up for Q&A.
Who's got a question? Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Karisa, and I was just kind of wondering on how you can make an effect in a certain culture if a culture has certain aspirations and they're changing their attitudes but not their behavior. How do you get them to change their behavior without incentivizing them with power or wealth?
Right, so I think you have to be really cautious when you do this, right? So one thing that you have to keep in mind is that you can try to control the material incentives, right? Doing things like offering people money in exchange for coming to talk to you, that's a problematic practice. And it's something that NGOs do all the time, right? But that is a sort of unknown entity now. People encounter lots of NGOs in the developing world. And you actually have to be, people are looking to attend NGO events and workshops and trainings and things like that in exchange for a sitting allowance or food or things like that. And so you're probably not going to have the effect you want to have under those conditions. I think it's also really important that you don't lead people to feel as though they might be punished for not changing quickly enough, right? That you sort of create a space where people can speak relatively freely about what they're still doing and why they're still doing it. Because having an actual clear line of communication where you as the activist and the people that you're speaking to can all speak relatively freely, that's going to be a really critical precondition for any kind of greater change. Absolutely, yeah. So he was asking about the differences between male respondents and female respondents. So I saw a few differences. And in some ways, actually, my communities are a little bit different than some of what the international evidence suggests. So internationally, a lot of survey research shows that actually men are likely to be more opposed to a practice like FGM than women. And that's partly because they experience more activism, right? They're out of the house more, they encounter more activists, they are more cosmopolitan, they travel more, they meet different kinds of people, and so their attitudes have often shifted faster than women's, right? They're better educated. In my communities, actually women remained more opposed to FGM and to early marriage, and especially to early marriage than men, right? So it is absolutely true that women play an important role in maintaining practices like FGM. This is not just something that sort of the men in women's lives impose upon them. Women are players here. But with something like early marriage, the gap really opens up. So men are much more likely to think that something like early marriage is okay, and women, by and large, think it is a terrible idea. Right? They just have even less control over marriage decisions for their daughters than they do over something like FGM. Sorry.
Yeah, you talked about some of the problems that happen when international norms conflict with local norms, but as some of the localities begin to change their attitudes and behaviors, kind of adjust to the international community, what happens when local norms become conflict with other local norms? How does that actually change that?
So I think that's actually a really important part of this story. So one thing that we have to keep in mind, right? Remember I said in Kenya countrywide, 21% of women undergo FGM, but close to 80% of Maasai women. That suggests that some ethnic groups are doing this in large numbers and other ethnic groups are not. That this is something that varies from group to group and from community to community. And so people are going to end up encountering other Kenyans with conflicting local norms. And they've been doing that for generations, right? But I think that the introduction of international activism makes those differences somehow more salient, right? So it causes people to think more carefully about the differences between them and, say, other ethnic groups in Kenya that they come into contact with. And I do find in the book that people and communities that experience more inter-ethnic interaction change more quickly. So the more that people encounter folks from other ethnic groups, the faster attitude change occurs and the faster behavior change occurs. So in some sense, it brings it closer to home. If you can observe other Kenyans, not just foreigners, but other Kenyans who don't do these things, then that can send a stronger signal that it's possible to change. And you can sort of observe girls from other communities living successful lives, and that's an important sort of demonstration effect. There's the possibility of intermarriage as a way of transferring local norms. And so in general, what we're seeing globally is that the countries with sort of mixed practice of something like FGM are experiencing more rapid declines.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, ma'am. I'm just Reed. I was wondering, a moment ago you were speaking to Mr. Ackerman's question, and you said how clear lines of communication are necessary to reconcile conflicts between norms. And I was wondering what you think about how we can reconcile those conflicts when the other party, the local party, is not very open to clear communication.
So I mean, that's a reality, I think, right? People don't often like being told what to do. You don't like being told what to do, and neither does anyone else. So I think it's a matter of approach. So it's not just coming in and telling people how they ought to change what they're doing. It's about coming in and being humble and listening, and maybe accepting that you don't actually know everything about what is right for the folks that you're trying to convince. Right? And I'm not saying that that's going to be a magic bullet that solves everything, that if you just are a little bit humble, somehow that will break down all cultural boundaries. But I think that's going to be a critical first step. And just in general, that we should accept that these things change very slowly. Right? You're not going to see some sort of miraculous decline in any kind, and not just FGM and early marriage, but all sorts of things that people do, right? That activists feel they should stop doing. We're talking about changes that are occurring over generations, not overnight.
Let's thank her for her time.
Sorry, I went a little long.
On behalf of the Naval Academy, we wanted to give you a small
thank
printout
you.
of the poster. Thank you for
Thanks
coming.
a lot.